Emily Bernard is Associate Professor of English and Alana U.S. Ethnic Studies at the University of Vermont. Her books include Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Some of My Best Friends, Writers on Interracial Friendship, was chosen by the New York Public Library as a book for the teen age. Michelle Obama, The First Lady in Photographs, a book she co-authored with Deborah Willis, received a 2010 NAACP Image Award. Her essays have been published in several anthologies and journals, such as American Scholar, Oxford American Magazine, Reader's Digest, Best American Essays, Best African American Essays, and Best of Creative Nonfiction. She has received fellowships from the Alphonse A. Fletcher Foundation, Yale University, the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. Her most recent essay about a stabbing that took place in 1994 is in the current issue of American Scholar. Her newest book, Carl Van Vechten and the Harlem Renaissance, A Portrait in Black and White, will be published by Yale University Press in February. So please help me welcome Professor Bernard.
Mic up here. Is this good? Can you hear me? It's okay. And this one. Okay, is that good too? Okay.
Not very well.
Not so great? Okay. What about this? Better? Am I doing this wrong?
You have it to your
Okay.
chin. Yeah.
Like that?
Okay. And maybe we'll pull up. Can I
Okay.
do it? We'll pull
No.
up.
Okay, great, thank you. Good evening, thanks for coming. I want to thank David and Frankie for the introductions and generally the Humanities Council for having me here. I love coming to Middlebury, so any excuse is good, and this is a great excuse. So thank you so much for coming to hear the talk, and I hope that we can have a good discussion afterward about interracial friendship. So, this picture here, they were two men separated by age, geography, and race. The white man was born in 1880 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The two men and the black man was born in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. He might be more familiar to you. It's Langston Hughes. They met at a party in 1925 where they were both reborn as intellectuals, writers, and celebrities. Their friendship caught fire immediately, and it changed their lives. Age didn't matter. They were equally devoted to the black cultural movement called the Harlem Renaissance. And racial difference, too, dissolved in the face of this powerful friendship. They were both, in equal measure, unembarrassed and unrepentant lovers of all things black. They remained friends until the end, until the white man died in 1964. So obviously this is Langston Hughes on the right, and this is Langston Hughes on the left and Carl Van Vechten on the right. He's less familiar these days, but the topic of this book I've been working on for ages. He was a white patron of black arts from the teens until his death, and Langston Hughes was one of his proteges. He, in some ways, launched that career, as well as many other careers of black writers during that period. It was their friendship that inspired my first book, Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten. And in some ways, in many ways, Some of My Best Friends was the logical next step. Remember Me to Harlem was, for me, much more than a story about the Harlem Renaissance, but a story about this remarkable friendship that thrived in spite of, or I think because of, racial barriers that could have made it impossible for the friendship to exist. The barriers were not interpersonal, but institutional. When they met, Jim Crow was the law of the land. Every social interaction between blacks and whites were based in a national conviction that blacks were not and would never be the social equals to whites. The legal code was also a belief system. For many white people, interracial friendship between equals, blacks and whites, was virtually unimaginable. But Carl Van Vechten was much smarter than that. But even Van Vechten, who was wealthy and socially powerful and of course white, could not escape the larger effects of Jim Crow. As I worked on Remember Me to Harlem, I started to wonder about interracial friendships as they exist today. What has changed now that Jim Crow laws and the doctrine of separate but equal have been outlawed? When I started the book, I was really inspired by the speech President Clinton made in 1992 after the Los Angeles uprising. And when he spoke to the nation about this horrible moment, he said that one of the problems, he thought, that had created that division between blacks and whites was the fact that so few white people, he said, had friends of other races. And I thought that was really fascinating how it came down for him beyond policy and beyond these institutional barriers to the individual relationships. And I believe that too. So that speech really inspired me to begin Some of My Best Friends. But the cliches, I think, that circulate in our culture right now about interracial friendship inspired me to finish it. In the classes that I teach at the University of Vermont, the course syllabi are always more integrated than the classrooms. And this is true across the university, no matter what course is being taught or who is teaching it. I teach African American literature, black stories, narratives, each with a beginning, middle, and end, of course. In the beginning of each of these narratives, there is desire for liberty, for a way out, for more. In the middle, there is conflict, usually with the institution of racism, either in human or spectral form. And in the end, there's a resolution, a literal and metaphorical freedom. The subjects of these stories are Black Americans, but their forms are universal. Before I begin my classes every semester with any particular Black story, I always begin with an apocryphal one that I borrowed from an essay called Ideology to Race in American History. It's a 1982 essay by the historian Barbara J. Fields. She describes an encounter between Francois Duvalier, or Papa Doc Duvalier, who was then the president of Haiti from 1957 to 1971. This interaction between Papa Doc and white American journalist. According to the story, the journalist asked Papa Doc what percentage of the population in Haiti was white. And Duvalier's answer, now I'm using Fields' words, astonishingly enough was 98%. The startled American journalist was sure he had either misheard or had been misunderstood, so he posed his question again. Duvalier assured him that he had heard and understood the question and that he had given the correct answer. Struggling to make sense of this incredible piece of information, the American journalist finally asked Duvalier, "How do you define white?" Duvalier answered the question with another question. "How do you define black in your country?" Receiving the explanation that in the United States, anyone with any black blood was considered black, Duvalier nodded and said, "Well, that's the way we define white in our country." I love that story. I really do. My students always enjoy it. I really enjoy watching their reactions as they try to make sense of the puzzle Fields had laid before them. In my best classes, the story is followed by long silences. And one day in one of these best classes, a student I'll call Daniela broke the silence to say, "Well, of course this makes sense since race is a social construction anyway." This was an upper level class full of sophisticated juniors and seniors. Everybody nodded and smiled. They were beyond race. They were over it. I really like Daniela. She's a student in another class I'm teaching now. And she has, before then, taken several other classes. And I have come to know her well as a person who is committed to anti-racism. And that's what she calls herself, an anti-racist. So issues pertaining to race and racial discrimination, justice are really central, not only in her formal education, but in her personal life. But I'm troubled and always troubled when students say things like this, because apparently what this means is that they don't see race at all. And I turned to her and I said, "Daniela, do you really believe this? That race doesn't really exist?" And she nodded me, apparently bewildered by my question. So I looked at her and at her peers. All of them were white. Some of them I knew well, and some of them were strangers to me. And I wanted to say, "Do you see me? Do I look like a construction to you?" But instead I said, "Well, if that's true, that race doesn't exist, then what are we doing here in an African American studies class?" So they all looked at me completely baffled, and I myself felt very confused. And it's a question that I've been pursuing a lot in my written work, as well as other classes. So Daniela turned absolutely pink. But of course, the question why we are here, I meant, why am I here? So I had another student in another class, very different than Daniela, who is a very serious student and a curious person. Tara is the sort of person my husband calls a trustafarian, with an undergraduate with blonde dreadlocks and no impending college loans. She was a freshman in a class I taught several years ago called Race and Ethnicity in Literary Studies. It's offered to first-year students, required students to fulfill a diversity requirement, which we enforce at the University of Vermont, which is a dose of intellectual castor oil, whose aim is to introduce the sheltered students, like Tara, to experiences of people who do not look like them. Tara drummed her fingers almost every class, her manicured fingernails on the table, cupping her head in her palm. On this particular day, I was trying to lead a discussion on Sandra Cisneros, her beautiful collection of vignettes called The House on Mango Street, which is a gorgeous collection of vignettes with a young Mexican-American narrator. It's a coming-of-age story. Tara sighed and slouched in her seat. Finally, she said, I just don't understand. Why do we have to talk about all of these things that divide us, like race? Why can't we talk about the things that bring us together? I was again dumbfounded. During our discussion, I had focused on the strength of Cisneros' prose, the care she took with word choice, and the universality of her themes. But apparently what Tara heard amounted only to foreign-sounding names and unfamiliar references. She saw things that made her uncomfortable, and even, perhaps, afraid. She didn't want to see them anymore. Colorblindness. This concept, of course, was a central aspiration of the Civil Rights era, and of course, beautifully articulated in the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is Dr. King's prophecy. That noble dream, I believe, has disappeared into a cliche, a catchphrase, colorblindness, which, like diversity, has become a way out of, as opposed to a way into, meaningful, complex, and textured discussions about race. At best, what the Civil Rights Movement appears to have produced is a generation that is keen to look beyond race, but finds on the other side not liberation, but confusion. Now that so many institutional inequities have been fixed, many people I know, including myself, are not quite sure what to do with the concept of race. In particular, I see a dangerous unspoken trend developing, a fear that to talk about race at all, to confess to seeing racial difference, is to be a racist. Years ago, to a friend, Michael, and his daughter Caitlin came over for a visit. At the time, Caitlin was 6 years old. As Michael and my husband talked, Caitlin began to admire a ring that I was wearing, and eventually turned the ring over turned my hand over to inspect the design of the ring. And I watched as her eyes fixed on my palm. She began to trace its etchings, which were so much more pronounced than her own. She turned her own hand over and put it next to mine. We sat there together on the couch, and I saw through her eyes something I had honestly never noticed before, even though my husband is white and I have many white friends. Caitlin and I, watching our palms together, were witnessing the evidence of racial difference. And I could feel a similar current of wonder and amusement connecting us. And I was grateful for that chance to discover the world anew, a gift that only children can give us. Suddenly, Michael looked over and very gently took Caitlin's hand away. He looked up at me with an apology in his eyes. And Caitlin looked from me to her father, and I could see her look of curiosity transform into confusion. She looked down at her hand and put it behind her back, and that current of delight disintegrated into shame. I knew that Michael was only trying to protect both of us. He didn't want to offend me, to interpret his daughter's curiosity as an act of racism. When it came to his daughter, I believe that he simply did not want her to see racial difference. The problem was, she did. A September 5th, you might remember this Newsweek article, 2009, ran that provocative cover line, "Is your baby a racist?" The upshot of the article is that Americans, in our quest to put racism behind us, have neglected to provide our children with an understanding of something that is obvious to them: race. We have not failed in this respect when it comes to gender. When our kids start making up stories about the differences between boys and girls, we are quick to say that boys can do anything that girls can do, and vice versa. That difference may be a physical reality, but it does not determine ability, lifestyle, or character. The lessons in the article appear to be directed at white parents, but I have been guilty of the same sin. Recently, I put my twin daughters, whom my husband and I adopted when they were a year old from Ethiopia, into their car seats in the morning, preparing to drive them to preschool. Through their open windows, they waved goodbye to their father until he turned and went back into the house. "Mommy, what color is Daddy's skin?" asked Julia, my younger twin, and I panicked. Just a few days before, my good friend Hillary, who was white if it matters, told me that her son had recently made a reference to the black guy at school. Their sons were 7. She panicked, and it turned out that her son meant the guy with the black shirt. So I grasped, remember this story, "Do you mean the color of Daddy's shirt?" "No," Julia responded calmly. "I mean, what color is Daddy's skin?" "It's tan," I began carefully. "Daddy's family is from Italy. Your skin is brown because you were born in Ethiopia. Mine is brown because my family is from the United States and Trinidad." She was silent. It appeared that I had gotten away with it. And so far, they have answered no more questions about the color of Daddy's skin. But a few days later, I heard Julia inform her sister that the reason that neither of them had remembered a parking lot that we passed every day was because they were born in Ethiopia. I've heard it said that a rite of passage in every parent, every black parent's life, or every parent of brown-skinned children, is when his or her child comes home with that question, "What does nigger mean?" I don't remember bringing that question to my parents, but I'm sure that I must have, because I cannot remember a time in my childhood when I did not know what the word meant. For as long as I can remember, I knew that nigger meant to be different, to be outside, to be less. When I became a mother, I began to wait for the moment in which my daughters would bring that question to me. I was sure that it would come, and I'm not quite, unsure that it won't come. Sure that it won't come. And then it occurred to me a little while ago that my story would not necessarily be my daughter's story. That perhaps they were discovering difference as pleasure. And it was me, and not the world, that was teaching them to be wary of difference, just like my friend Michael. Within days of the historic 2008 election, suddenly Americans were struck colorblind. People on all sides of the political spectrum claimed that race no longer mattered. On the day of the election, in fact, the right-wing commentator William Bennett posted on the company's website, on his blog, I believe, "No more excuses," which was a message to black people. He meant that black Americans could no longer incorporate race as a factor in accounting for institutional inequities between blacks and whites. The fact that black men are 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, that poverty and illnesses related to poverty affect black people disproportionately more than whites, and that even in this recession, African Americans continue to have an unemployment rate that is 88% higher than that of whites. According to Bennett, this has nothing to do with race at all. Many Obama supporters took pleasure in claiming that race played no role in the way they voted. President Obama gave many people an opportunity to practice that color blindness that had heretofore been only a belief or a theory. My students, from Daniela to Tara, saw the election as evidence of a break with a hateful past that they believed had nothing to do with them. One friend told me that while he enjoyed pulling down the lever that would put a black man in the highest nation in the country, in the highest office in the country, he saw Obama as a universal figure. When he looked at President Obama, he saw a reflection of himself. The problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. I'm stealing this prophetic sentence from Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, who was in many ways the father of the new Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, and one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He was a statesman and a writer, an activist who was born in the mid-19th century and lived born in the 19th century and lived until the 60s. And so we saw, everything from the Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Third Reich. I mean, he saw it all. All of it, and the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement. He's quite an individual. For many people, Barack Obama, his color and his race, has proven to be a problem, while for others, a solution. For those who are drawn to his story and moved by it, I often ask people, what's so appealing about it? I believe that he represents more than success and kind of personal vitality and the hope of national regeneration. His story is a story about Black progress writ large and the hope of moving away from that classic story of deficiency, of the not gots and don't haves that have, according to the writer Charles Johnson, characterized Black narratives since the inception of Black presence in this country. Obama's body, I think figuratively, is a bridge across generational, national, and racial boundaries. He's given many people new stories to tell about race. The presidency of Barack Obama has opened endless conversations about race, and some of them productive, as we know, some of them ugly. He has opened the eyes of many people to the continued existence of racism, but he's also the hope that racism may well end one day. He's been called the incarnation of the colorblind dream of Dr. King, but he may also be the host of another kind of colorblindness. In medical terms, colorblindness is a problem. It's a disability, a deficiency. It has symptoms and treatments. And in its current cultural incarnation, I've come to believe that colorblindness is a symptom of something like an epidemic. And more than a willed blindness, is a kind of a muteness too. What if we were to take off our color blinders and open our mouths and simply admit that we see racial difference every day? What if we made our public and private conversations about race a source of pleasure and humor, and not fear or shame? How do we begin? I believe the answer is in friendship, individual relationships, intimate communion between self and other. The personal is political, goes the cliche. To the social critic Benjamin DeMott, the cliche is toxic. In his book, The Trouble with Friendship, Why Americans Can't Think Straight About Race, DeMott writes, at the heart of today's thinking about race lies one relatively simple idea, that the race situation in America is governed by the state of personal relations between blacks and whites. DeMott describes this way of thinking as a belief system he calls the friendship orthodoxy, which he contends in his book is a destructive delusion. What the friendship orthodoxy destroys, he says, is common sense. Friendship cannot heal systemic injustices. Ever increasing inequalities between blacks and whites cannot be leveled over coffee at Starbucks. Racism is a consequence of power, he says, and not of personal animosity between the races. I read this is a conversation between DeMott, Noel Ignatieff, and Cornel West, and a young kind of hip-hop writer, Upski Wimsat. It was a great conversation. And Noel Ignatieff, if you don't know his work, he wrote a wonderful book called How the Irish Became White. And he agrees, he agrees with DeMott and says, you don't need to be friends with black folks to hate white supremacy and oppose it. He talks about this in this conversation. It's called I'm au fait, you're au fait. A transcript of a conversation between Ignatieff and Upsky, as I said, in Cornell West. Ignatieff is arguing with Upsky Wimsatt primarily and says, you can do that, meaning you can fight white supremacy from North Dakota and Montana, where there's not a black person within 500 miles. So Upsky, who's a different generation young man, begs to differ in this conversation. He argues that whites who challenge white supremacy must often have deep relationships with black people. Those are his words. And Ignatieff retorts in this article, for you, friendships, who your friends are and so forth, becomes the test. For me, it's not the test. It's just a step on the path to getting ready for the test. So I find myself between both Upsky and Wimsatt. I'm really curious to see where you all might find yourselves in this discussion. Their views, of course, contain as many similarities as differences. In general, I do not believe that there is always a neat distinction between the interpersonal and the institutional. It is possible to oppose white supremacy while remaining cool or even hostile to the concept of interracial intimacy. Frederick Douglass wrote those wonderful narratives in the 19th century, The Fugitive Slave, Frederick Douglass. He commented often on the paradox that American abolitionists, who often, of course, hated slavery, sometimes hated its victims just as vehemently. In another article by Upsky Wimsatt called We Use Words Like Macadocious, he satirizes Wiggers, as he calls them, which are updated versions of Norman Mailer's white Negroes, who idolize hip-hop and musicians and don't know any black people, and even sometimes feel fear in their presence. Friendship does not necessarily lead to liberation. Liberation does not necessarily lead to friendship. As a concept, it has its limits, but in its execution, fine examples abound. I really am inspired by the friendship between Van Vechten and Hughes. To me, it's a model. In this moment of racelessness, Van Vechten was raceful in the way that he really took pleasure and joy in difference, and that's something he wrote about very publicly in his life. So now we're on the eve of 2012, and I believe we still are on the verge. We still have the potential to take more substantial risks than those that are demanded from us every day. Once you succeed in that awesome project of coming to see yourself in another person, other obstacles, I feel, are surmountable, and other challenges, of course, are visible. At its best, friendship represents a portal onto possibilities for change. New identities are built once the divide between you and me is collapsed. To recognize difference and sameness at once, to understand that friendship ought not satisfy our desire for equality, but rather ignite in us a lifelong insistence for justice across racial lines. This, I believe, is the power of friendship. And I don't believe any other institution, any other vehicle that we can find can really affect those kinds of changes. Thank you. If you don't mind, I'd like to just read a little bit in the introduction of the book, just the questions that motivated me to put together the book. These are questions, of course, that have occupied me since childhood. I grew up, we integrated our neighborhood in the 1970s in Nashville where all deliberate speed was taken very literally. In fact, I integrated my kindergarten class. So these questions have been with me forever. Which ingredients make interracial friendships possible? Which factors destroy them? At what point does unintentional racial ungainliness become willful racial insensitivity? What do other people do? I was asking myself as I was pulling together writers for the book, what do other people do at those moments when racial difference rears its head uncomfortably in a friendship? Those are the questions that I started with, and the challenge, of course, to find writers who agreed to dig deep enough, to be honest enough to answer these questions. And I can't tell you the numbers of revisions. There are many people who wrote, who said, I don't want to reveal these things. I don't want to reveal the ways that I have been made uncomfortable by racial difference, the stupid things I've said. And one of the essays I'm most proud of, and I'm going to forget his name, but he was used as a kind of tool during the campaign. He was part of the Weather Underground. Do you know his name? I can't remember now. Okay, so I'll look in the table and remember his name. But you remember he was using the tool, Obama associated with him, so he was a communist and so on and so forth. So he wrote this great essay, and he himself fashions, he's a leftist and he's progressive, so he wanted to write that kind of essay. And we went back and forth so many times, and kept saying, and I was afraid I would lose him. Come on, tell me more. I know there's more to the story. I know it's not just a surface story about your triumph, and all the things you achieved for racial progress. And he told this amazing story about when he was sort of getting educated, into a kind of leftist belief system, and he was reading Marx with various people. He had this older black male friend who mentored him and talked to him about socialism and communism. He learned, so much under his tutelage. And he asked himself at the end of that essay, what did I ever give this man? And the answer was nothing. I gave him nothing. And I just thought that was so powerfully honest. When we think about our friendships and what we ask from each other, and particularly when we're wanting to be educated, across differences. It happens a lot in my classrooms, of course, and I have to always tell my students, you have to feel honest in here. I don't want platitudes, Don't talk to me about oppression, in some general way to try to please me, because that's a waste of our time. And it's very difficult. Often they're only white students and it takes them a while. They're so afraid, again, of talking about difference, because what they think is if they say anything, that I'll think they're a racist, right? They have to pretend they don't see it. And I always tell them about the story to kind of loosen them up. When I was in college, I mean, there are other stories to tell, but I was in college and I was part of this discussion group, and I used the term Oriental because it's a term I'd grown up with, and coming from the South, not particularly sophisticated background where I lived, right? So I didn't understand the implications of the term, and I didn't understand the term had fallen out of favor, so I was using this term, and a young woman took me aside and explained to me that, to talk about the Orient, all these stereotypes that are involved with that, and against the Occident, and I wouldn't have known otherwise. And I always think of that as a model for teaching, to presume that people make mistakes, they're doing the best they can with what they have. And it's, to me, because I was given that opportunity to revise myself and relearn something. I had a student recently, I didn't know the difference, for instance, between transsexual and transgender. And I'm embarrassed, in this day and age, I didn't know that. And she, again, I said something in class that made it clear I didn't understand the difference. And she took me aside and gave me a little education. And I always think that, sort of passing that along. And even those moments, you're frustrated and you think, why doesn't this person get this? Remembering those moments and trying to, to me that's a model. It's sometimes not always easy. But again, to presume the best and to understand that there are these bridges divides we can bridge just in conversation, just in asking those questions and being patient with each other. I know this sounds obvious, but it's something that I have to kind of get up and reinvent every day, and classrooms and interpersonal relationships. So now I'm eager to hear from you all about this. Yes. Oh, sorry.
What is the difference between trans?
Oh. Well, basically, there's a difference between gender and sex, I guess. Transgender is to sort of it's a different kind of social category. It doesn't involve any operation, any medical changes, any biological changes. Whereas transsexual means that you're either going through that process, pre-op or post-op. So this was something I learned not long ago. Does that make sense?
Not quite.
Okay. Maybe somebody else can help me with this. Please.
Transgender is how you identify.
Okay.
To be
Yes.
in the body of a man, but identify as a woman.
Right.
Transsexual usually means you're either planning to, or you already have gone through some kind of medical, hormonal, or surgery
Right.
related thing to physically become gender, not more.
Thank you.
Right, so
For that.
transsexual is easy.
Yeah. Transgender, yeah, maybe is more complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Is a male homosexual a transgender by that definition?
No, no. Yeah, someone who's transgender, or trans is often, yes, I'm sorry, as the young woman said here, is physically or biologically, let's say, male, but identifies as a woman, is more comfortable with being identified and being, as a woman. Does that make sense?
May look like a woman,
Okay.
people may have a female name.
Right,
You
exactly.
might know them as a woman, but were born as a person.
Right.
So that includes cross-dressing?
No,
Not necessarily.
not necessarily. Because cross-dressing, I mean, you can be a straight person, a heterosexual person, and cross-dress, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your sexual identification. It's all very fascinating. But yeah, it's a new world.
Maybe it's because we're getting old and we'll leave all this behind someday.
You think?
Life was so simple when we were young.
Well, so, Van Vechten was, and there's so many terms, you can use, throughout the generations. Van Vechten was, has been called homosexual, bisexual. He was married for 50 years. I keep pointing, he's not there anymore. But he was married for 50 years to a woman, and they had a very passionate relationship. It wasn't always sexual, but they had a very passionate relationship. 50 years is a long time. And so today, in today's parlance, he's sort of called queer. But throughout 3 generations, and he, of course, is something that, was not a topic of public conversation. But an interesting thing about Van Vechten is that, but he was so formidable that he didn't make a secret of it. But the terms are such modern terms, right, when we think about the categories. People have always lived this way, but they're modern terms. And dare I venture into this category, but this story. But Van Vechten left, so he created this wonderful archive, and the book that I just wrote is about the archive, called the James Weldon Johnson Collection of, it used to be called Negro Arts and Letters, but now it's just called the James Weldon Johnson Collection. Just leave the whole thing behind, that question of terminology. And it's the biggest and most exciting, most thorough archive of black materials available in the country, rivaled in some respects by the Schomburg collection in New York. But he spent years, and God knows we had all this room in his apartment in New York, but he had, first editions and drafts of manuscripts and thousands of letters that he had saved over the course of, his life. He was a collector from the time of his childhood. And anyway, so he created this amazing collection with the help of many friends and people working around the clock for no pay to create this collection. Took amazing photographs. All the photographs you might see of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, he took most of those photographs. He had this incredible eye and understanding of who might become famous. And so he would take pictures of an 18-year-old Diane Carroll. He really had an eye for that, a sense of it. So this archive, which is, thousands, and more than that, it's just really a very impressive, vast archive. He kept scrapbooks as well, any article he could find pertaining to anything black. He pasted them in these volumes of scrapbooks. And it's the only reason I could do the books I've done, because he put it all together there. But he also kept another collection of scrapbooks, and they were all full of pornography, homemade pornography of his friends' drawings, but also he cut out articles. He saw the codings of the of sexuality in the invisible corners of newspaper articles, et cetera, people, men who, suicides that were clearly about discrimination and self-hatred and having no place in society because of sexuality. So he kept all these scrapbooks and he had them sealed. And he was very close friends with the Yale archivist, and he said, these have to be sealed until 25 years after my death. So of course they complied, because Van Vechten was a really big deal. And so he died in '64. So in '89, they had no idea what it was. Everyone thought, well, maybe there is an autobiography, maybe another novel. And so when they were opened, all these, all these volumes, and of course they were really comical. There's some, he cut out these like a ransom note letters from newspaper and put them together. So there's one like Yale, last laugh is on Yale, and that kind of thing. But they're also quite serious, because they're a record of mostly gay male life before the Stonewall Rebellions, where, a great milestone in the history of gay culture. when at a club called the Stonewall Inn in New York, the Village, yeah, the police came down to break up the scene, all this vice, and people fought back, overcame. So it was really coming out. So he kept, this was an incredible record, and I always think that's so fascinating because he knew at that time, that was in the 30s, when he put together the black materials. The library couldn't wait to get them. No one else was asking for these materials. But he said, I know what's going to happen, but there's one day going to be a department of Negro life and culture, he said, and you'll need this collection. And he knew that in the 30s. And Yale never didn't start that department or that field of study until the 60s, 68. So he was so far ahead of the time. But I believe he also hoped that one day we would be at a point, we'd be able to talk about what it means to be gay. It could be part of a conversation. You didn't have to live in secret. But of course, he thought that would happen much, much later. And now, of course, those scrapbooks are a really incredible resource for scholars, people who are doing work. There's a great book by George Chauncey called Gay New York. And he charts gay male life from the 1890s, 1940s. And again, just back to what we were talking about, one of the points he makes is that, again, these terms that we use now, gay, bisexual, these are modern ways we think about sexuality. And in some ways, people lived more interestingly, or in an earlier time, like Van Vechten, who, was just an incredibly passionate and carnivorous kind of person. And so he just, he was very sensual, and even his relationships with women were always, there were tones of romance, and people, they talked about being in love with him, and it was all very playful and fun. And so that's another reason why I find him so fascinating, because of all the ways that he understood the culture and imagined how it might change. I can't say enough about Carl Van Vechten. Oh, I'm sorry, I've been going on and on.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
no, not at all. I came here with a couple of questions in my head that have been floating around, but then as you were talking, I thought of something else. So, I'm putting together thoughts of my childhood here in Middlebury with a mother who taught me to, think of people as equals. She married a black man who was a college peer of hers here at Middlebury. I have a sister who identifies as black. I'm not. I'm very different than she is. And that's how I was raised. And that coupled with the thought of nobody ever talks about black people being racist toward white people. And I wonder, because I'm so ignorant about this, do black families try and teach their children not to be racist? Because as I've lived longer, I have felt that reverse racism. And I wonder why nobody ever talks about that. I think it's almost like, well, that's just what white people deserve after years of mistreating black people. You're getting your little bit of just desserts. But that's supposed to be in the past. We're not supposed to beat up on people for what their grandparents and great-grandparents did. Or we're at least supposed to give people a chance. Right. Before we assume that they don't think right of us or don't think of us as equals. So, you see where I'm going with
I
this
do see where you're
question?
going, absolutely.
Is tolerance something that's treated in, there's a lot more racism in this country than just white and black.
Yeah,
but those
exactly.
are the two easy
That's certainly the way we're talking tonight.
categories to think of. Do you think that black moms and dads?
I have a lot of ways. I'm just going to say, Toni Morrison, I love the way she said in interviews that, her father was racist. But his racism was to teach her, she grew up in Lorain, Ohio, she was born in the 30s.
And both her parents were black?
Both of her parents are black. I said Toni Morrison, right? Yeah.
I know who she is. I asked
Yes.
both of her parents.
Yeah, yes, that's right. But she talked about it, her father wanted to give her, that armor. So if we went out into the world, it was almost like to compensate, right? The world is going to tell you you're nothing, that you're less, that you're not anything, you're not, you don't belong, you're not wanted. So for him, it was a way of compensating for that and say, actually, you're better, So that is, and she talked about at the very opening, she uses the word racism. I can just sort of talk about my mother, who was not a racist. She grew up in the segregated South. And she grew up where, she would walk to school and white boys would, throw rocks at her. She's going to school. I don't think she was ever really comfortable with white people. because of that history, yes, and all the things we carry, I think, that baggage. And in some ways, in my house, I always think, we were all black, but the generational differences were so important and in some ways unspoken because I went to an integrated school. And in some ways, the difference was because what happened is that, those questions about identity came up for me that didn't come up for my parents. They attended segregated schools. But, so I think that discomfort, there were a lot of ways to unpack that and think about it. That discomfort, which is part of a historical, reality, that you can't trust white people, that you can't trust white people. Again, this was, something I saw my mother's generation, because they will betray you. And I wrote about this in the introduction to my book. And I think that's something, again, my mother carried her whole life. And I think if she had lived longer, she was very open, very curious person. But there were so many barriers to her understanding that because, again, her experience of race was so traumatic. It wasn't about pleasure at all. It was about, trying to defend yourself from literally being terrorized, growing up in, the segregated South. So the question of, yes, do I imagine, yes, what I see, what I imagine, again, my mother carried that, but I meant to say that she always talked about equality, and she always talked about, that was the ambition, to see people as equals, no matter what the world was saying outside. So my impression is that yes. But what happens, I think, in a lot of black families, and again, I can't speak for everyone, is the sense of, having to buffer your children, to work against the stereotypes, work against, now I'm the mother of black children, and they're very dark-skinned. And let me tell you how hard it is to find characters, in movies and dolls that reflect who they are and reflect them as beautiful. I tell them every day, you're gorgeous, you're beautiful, and your skin is so beautiful. And I think it's something we have to enforce or reinforce in our children that for white parents of white children don't have to enforce, because all of these things are out there to say, you exist, and you're part of the culture and you are beautiful. I always, the question of my daughters, and they love Barbies. And so I always have the question, have you read The Bluest Eye? Anybody in here? So it's Toni Morrison's first novel, and it's all about internalized racism. So it's about a little girl who wants blue eyes. That's what she wants, blue eyes, because she hates herself. And nobody's ever told her that she was beautiful. And so, of course, I read that, I think about that, but, I also don't want to stigmatize what they love. They love Barbies. And I will say, where are the brown Barbies? And they'll say, once my daughter said, Mommy, it's just pretend. And so, okay. But I do try to look for those, and it's difficult. So again, I think the work that many black parents have to do at home, or white parents of black children, because I talk to friends of mine who have black children, is to give your children, again, that armor. Go out in the world, you are beautiful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You are meaningful, and you exist. And that's hard. Even in this day and age, I was so surprised that there wasn't more out there for my daughters, you know what I'm saying? So I guess that's sort of around your question.
And that's one thing, but then teaching distrust or talking about
Yeah.
white people in negative ways,
Mhm.
I would think that would
Mhm.
just continue
Yeah.
racism
Okay.
if that keeps going on.
Okay. Fritz, please.
I just want to say, I grew up in a black ghetto,
Mhm.
and there was racism against white people.
Okay.
And it was, as you stressed, armor,
Yeah.
survival armor.
Mhm.
And one of the words that over the years I've learned, and you used it earlier, is power.
Mhm.
And what I realized is there are black racists, but they don't have the power of the white racists.
Yeah.
And that is a huge, huge difference.
They don't control institutions that can enforce racism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is a huge difference between the two.
I think that's right.
I don't,
Mhm.
I agree with her in
Mhm.
terms of equality and opportunity and positive reinforcement, but I'm very, very much aware of what a black racist can do as opposed to what a white racist can do. And that to me is a pivotal difference. You're
Yeah.
one person, there are thousands and millions of black people who have had that same experience.
Yeah.
Because the white power structure
Yeah.
supported them. The white power structure does not support or condone that kind of activity. They're very outspoken about it. So you may be one, and it's a real experience,
Yeah.
but it's not multiplied by how many black people.
I think that's a great
Same
distinction.
group.
But it's sort of like the chicken and the egg, like where's it gonna end?
Mhm.
How are we gonna
Mhm.
stop it? Because if somebody's nasty to me,
Mhm.
then can't that reinforce
Mhm.
some,
But only if you imagine their nastiness has to do with race. I mean, sometimes people have a bad day, you know, and you can sort of think it's about race, but maybe it's about a multitude
oh, I
of
totally
things.
get that.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, watching the cashier and who's going through her line.
Right,
Who she smiles at, who,
right.
But
Yeah.
the more into marriage you have, the ultimate solution is everybody will save the break.
I've heard that before too. Yeah, I think that's right.
It may take a while.
Yeah,
but-
exactly. And I think that, to let one incident then let you decide how to feel, or to say, well, that's, black people are racist. And I don't think you're saying that.
no.
But
I think that I hear people on TV and movies
Yeah.
very freely take pot shot at white people like they're all racist,
Mhm.
or that so many of them are racist, and nobody ever says, maybe that's not really such a cool thing to say, because a white person can't say
Mhm.
things like that about black people. So
Mhm.
I really think there's a double standard.
yeah. Well, I hear a lot of people say things like that about black people. Have you been to the internet?
Accepted as,
Uh-huh.
it's
Yeah.
not seen as evil for a black person to say
Mhm.
disparaging things.
Mhm.
It's like nobody ever says, hey,
You need to pick your friends better.
I'm not talking about friends, I'm talking about people I see on TV.
Okay. Well, I think actually, do you have a response to this, or I think both of you do?
Not directly to
Okay.
that, it tied into something that was said a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Or even earlier when you were talking. One of, in my opinion, current problems in our culture is that we're all supposed to be colorblind. We're not supposed to see black and white.
Mhm.
And the problem with that is it sets up a whole bunch of no-talk rules.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right, I
many of
agree.
us grew up in families of whatever color
Mhm.
with no-talk rules, and that then becomes bad secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Your
Yeah.
skin color's different from mine, but
Mhm.
that, we ought to be able to talk about that
Mhm.
and acknowledge that underneath it all, we've
Mhm.
probably got a lot of commonalities.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
But if we aren't allowed to see
Yeah.
difference in skin color or ethnicity,
Right.
that sets us up for big trouble going forward.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I don't know if this is right. I just thought of back to your question, I guess, in some way. Do you know that the activist or the writer Tim Wise?
Yes, he was here.
Oh, he was here.
I have a DVD of his
Okay.
presentation at the library in Dana and stuff, yes.
Okay, so he's a white writer. Oh, and he's actually went to high school with him. He writes a lot of exciting, and he's a white man, young white man, talking about race and racism, and speaking out against white racism, and talking about, again, power.
Yes.
Where you're prejudiced, but you have the power to enforce or to, continue sort of those racial differences and balances. That's racism. But he tells a powerful story, and I always think it's great to wrestle with. His grandmother, and he grew up in Nashville too, of course. She, was a civil rights activist, if you will. She was just, she's a homemaker, but in her own way, she fought racism. Neighbors and family. I mean, she just was relentless and fierce and unembarrassed. But when she got very, very old, she developed Alzheimer's. And an unfortunate feature of that Alzheimer's is I don't know if he told this story. It's one of his books. When his mother was in a nursing home, something happened to her brain, and she became very, very racist. And she had a black woman who attended her, and she would say the most hateful things. So Tim talked about how this was not his mother. You know what I'm saying? This was Alzheimer's. And the nurse understood that. She actually didn't. She understood it because she'd seen it before. And I think, again, I'm going to well up in tears because the idea of she took care of this woman in her old age and saw this woman not as a white racist again, but as a person who was suffering. And that's what came out of her in her suffering. And that to me is an incredible model of generosity, and just appreciation for humanity. Because that's what she saw in this woman. And that is remarkable. I mean, how many of us could do that? Take that every day. And for Tim too, for him, he loved his grandmother. And he was so embarrassed, to go to see her in her nursing home. But again, it was just it was something back in her history that she could not control, right? She couldn't control it. It was back there, what she heard around the dinner table, and what she worked her whole life against. But this is not who she was. And so I guess that's the story to respond to what you're saying. And you had a question.
Well, my question has to do with, in all my life, I never have lived in such a white environment as Vermont.
I hear you, sister. Uh-huh.
That there's very little actually to teach children or for children to have experiences interracially, and I'm not sure what to do about this.
It's interesting what you're saying. When you don't have the numbers, what do you do?
And you don't have anybody
Right.
who is
Yeah.
any other race.
Right. How do you?
And so you could do slides on inadequate.
Yes, I agree with you. I think this woman. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
But this is, I think, a problem for everybody who
Yeah.
is living in Vermont, and maybe in other communities too, that, so we live in a white country, a white state, and maybe eventually it'll be more mixed. Maybe not. I don't know. How do you see us moving usefully
Yeah.
in this state?
That's a great question, and I think I saw your hand shoot up. Maybe you can answer here.
Formal traditional kids in the community. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where my family all still lives. I homeschool my kids right now. The numbers are growing, even in Madison County. There are 6 kids of color in the high school right now in Middlebury. By the time my kids get there, there'll be over 40, and those are just the kids of color that we know that are friends with my kids in the surrounding community. So even though it'll still be maybe 10 kids per grade, it's growing exponentially as we speak. Still not a big group of kids.
Right.
We had some real issues with Mary Hogan when we tried to put our first 2 kids in the kindergarten. And that's one of the reasons that we're homeschooling is related to race. There's a principal there who's been there a really long time, and there's no basic language to recognize any of the things that we're talking about. There's nobody who can say Asian or black with a straight face. I was told that my child would be treated the same even if they were purple-toned or polka-dotted. I was shocked because we had lived here a couple of years. We moved from Burlington and from out of state before that. And I was hearing language that I hadn't heard used since the late 70s where I grew up in St. Louis, and I couldn't believe that someone who had had quote-unquote diversity training in the school system was using the word color to describe their children. There's a long way to go, and if you talk to any parent of kids of color around here, they will all tell you the same thing. But as my husband likes to continuously point out, which is why we've been here so long, there is forward progress, and that's all you can really ask for. It's a big deal, and Judah, who's the librarian who was here before, did a really great job of bringing a lot of, the children's section in the library here is like the best selection with kids of color represented across the board and everything. But it's hard, and it's a small community. It's a small community, and I would say it's a larger community of kids because it's transracially adopted kids than it is adults of color around here, which is challenging for college students and for families in the community. And just because there aren't a lot of people of color here doesn't mean that there isn't aversive and underground racism, because just as exhausting to go out and deal with every day as anywhere else, it's more obvious. But I'm rambling there.
It's a great question, though. Frankie, please.
Well, I was just going to say, as somebody that taught in high school for a long time, when I first came here, you could count, you only needed half the fingers on one hand, and most of those children were children who were either biracial and then they had also been adopted. I think one of the issues at the high school is, back to what you were saying, is that nobody wants to talk about it. For me, I think a huge issue at Middlebury Union High School is class. But nobody wants to talk about that.
That's very true.
That's
Mhm.
the other one.
Yep.
And I also think at this high school, because as you said, Middlebury is so non-diverse, class is the huge elephant in the room, but we're not talking about class. We're not going to talk about class. And I think
They're
that
gonna
is,
have to do it very soon because there's a whole contingent of kids coming on.
there is, and I think that I'm imagining that the difficulty is going to be exactly the problem to which you alluded, which is how are you going to get the grown-ups and the institution to talk about these things that they really don't want to talk about. I mean, there are, as far as I'm concerned, there's a list as long as your arm of stuff that they don't want to talk about, and I'm imagining that class and race are kind of bringing up
I mean,
the
one of the
rear.
issues, there's not one teacher or administrator of color, not one.
No, and in very
And
many
so,
ways, I can see why. I mean, I felt odd
And I've
over
had,
there.
and I've watched
over
friends
the
that
years.
have, and I've known people that moved here and then actually turned around and went back to the like, it's challenging, and I think that about thinking about whether we're gonna send our kids to high school eventually versus hope. And they're so integrated into their community and they have their friends here and everything else, but like, but it is, but I've certainly had people say when we got serious about moving a couple years back, it didn't work out, don't move away like your children are. Then my children won't have any best friends. And I went, my child is not like your it makes you rethink what people are thinking.
With Vermont's population not particularly growing exponentially, so where is the exponential growth of color coming in the Middlebury High School? Where is it coming from?
Significant amount of transracial
Adoption.
adoption. So mostly white parents still, not all.
Yeah.
but, like,
It's what I mean. Vermont is so full of these fascinating ironies. One of the whitest states in the union, but per capita, the most multiracial families. I think that's right. Anywhere in the country. I mean, so that, and I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be simple. I mean, I am with you. I mean, it's hard, and I feel it. What do you do when you just don't have the numbers of people, but you want to address these questions and you want to have those interactions? But I know in my neighborhood, it's more integrated, my neighborhood in Burlington, than the neighborhood I grew up in, which we're still the only black family. I mean, it's a different climate now, not when I was growing up, there was a country club down the road, no blacks, no Jews, and that's obviously, you can't do that anymore. And the mood is different. But, this is, I think it's so odd, in this country. And I talked about the classrooms where you have more books by black writers than you have black students. That's happening around the country. Again, with the class differences. I mean, only so many people can go to college. And I think, as we talk about race, in some ways, I'm making the mistake that many of us make. We're talking about race, but maybe we're talking about class too. We're talking about race, but there's so many other things we ask race to do. But I agree with you, these class-based differences, aren't those the things that are becoming more pronounced? And they do cut across racial lines. So how are we going to address these things while addressing the persistence of racism? But back to your question, I'm really with you. I wish we could talk more about it. What do you do if you want to create those connections with people?
Kindergarten through fifth grade schoolhouse in South Burlington.
Yes, that's right. It's a great school.
That's where our daughter sent our granddaughter. I think one of the things that impressed me the most was, I don't want to say cocky, it was the feeling, I'm as good as you are. And she's now in public school. No problem. No, she knows who she is.
Right.
She knows what she can do, what she's worth, that she'll tell you.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe being in a school young
Yeah.
where there's more black people.
Yeah.
God knows we're Irish enough that we're pretty white.
Excuse me. Yes. Uh-huh. Right, right. That's wonderful that she already has that sense of self. That's great. That's wonderful that she got that at home. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily.
Oh,
We
thank
really
you.
appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I could mention that there are a few Christmas presents over here on the table. And I think
A goodie bag.
and